The student union building was packed. It was that time of day when classes had just let out, and everyone was looking for a place to crash, grab a coffee, or just make some noise before the next lecture started. The air smelled like burnt espresso and old floor wax. The sound was a wall of noise, shouting, laughing, the clatter of chairs scraping against the linoleum, and the constant hum of 100 different conversations all happening at once. In the far corner of the room, slightly away from the worst of the traffic, sat an old upright piano. It wasn't a grand instrument. The black finish was chipped around the legs, and someone had carved the small initials into the wood near the keys. It looked like it had been there for decades, surviving purely on luck and the occasional tuning. Ilora walked into the hall with her backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she wore a large, gray cardigan that looked like it belonged to an older relative. She wasn't here for the coffee or the social scene. She was here because she had a break between her history lecture and her chemistry lab, and she had heard that there was a piano you could play if you asked nicely. She had been playing since she was a little girl. Music was the only thing that ever made sense to her. When life got too loud or too complicated, sitting at a keyboard was the only way to turn the volume down in her head. But playing at home in her living room was very different from playing here. She stood by the wall for a moment, just watching. The piano was empty. A guy with a skateboard was sitting on top of it, texting on his phone, but he eventually hopped down and skated away. This was her chance. Ilora took a deep breath and walked over. Her shoes squeaked on the floor, but no one noticed. She felt small in the big room. She felt like she didn't quite fit in with the groups of confident students laughing at tables or the people rushing around with important papers in their hands. She sat down on the bench. It was hard and uncomfortable. She ran her fingers over the cold, white keys. It felt familiar, grounding. She pulled her sheet music out of her backpack. It was a little crumpled. She smoothed it out on the music rack. It was Debussy's Clair de Lune. It was a beautiful piece, but it was delicate. It required softness, patience, and a lot of control. It wasn't a song that demanded attention, it was a song that asked for it. Ilora placed her hands on the keys. She took another breath, trying to ignore the smell of food and the sound of a group of guys laughing loudly a few feet away. She closed her eyes for a second to find her focus, and then she began to play. The first notes were soft. Ding, ding. They were crystal clear, tiny drops of water in a storm. The melody started to weave its way through the air, gentle and sad. But in this room, gentle didn't stand a chance. The piano was old, and the hammers were a bit loose, so it didn't have a huge volume. The sound was swallowed up almost instantly by the noise of the crowd. People were shouting about a basketball game. A tray crashed onto a table nearby. The hiss of the espresso machine drowned out the high notes of the melody. Ilora didn't stop. She kept playing, trying to put more feeling into it, trying to make the music speak louder. But it was a struggle. She was fighting against the energy of the room, and she was losing. She could feel her heart beating faster. She felt exposed. She was sitting in the middle of a chaotic crowd, playing a quiet, intimate song about moonlight, and it felt ridiculous. Just a few yards away, standing near the pillar that separated the seating area from the hallway, was Jason. Jason was the kind of person who always had an audience. He was wearing a t-shirt for a rock band that had broken up years ago and jeans that were ripped on purpose. He was loud, he was funny, and he liked being the center of attention. He was leaning against the wall, holding a large soda, surrounded by 3 of his friends. They were watching the crowd, making jokes about people walking by. Then Jason heard the piano. He looked over and saw the girl in the oversized cardigan. She was hunched over the keys, her face serious, moving her fingers with careful precision. He watched her for a moment. He didn't hear the beauty in the music. He didn't hear the hours of practice. He just saw the contrast. He saw this quiet, intense girl trying to play this whisper-soft song in the middle of a noisy, chaotic cafeteria. To him, it looked funny. It looked out of place. It looked like she didn't get the joke. "Hey, check this out," Jason said, nudging his friend with his elbow and pointing his cup toward the corner. His friends looked over. One of them scoffed. "Is she serious?" the friend asked. Elora hit a slightly wrong chord. She winced but kept going, trying to recover the rhythm. She was trying so hard. Her brow was furrowed, and her body was swaying slightly with the music, completely unaware of the eyes on her. Jason let out a sharp, barking laugh. It wasn't a quiet chuckle, it was a loud, mocking sound that cut right through the ambient noise of the room. "Man," Jason said, his voice carrying clearly. "It looks like she's trying to play a lullaby in a mosh pit." "What is this?" His friends laughed. It was that specific kind of group laugh that feeds on itself. They weren't being malicious, maybe, but they were being cruel. They were entertaining themselves at someone else's expense. "Turn it up, maybe they'll hear you in the library," one of the other guys shouted. Elora's hands jerked. The sound of the laugh hit her like a physical slap. It shattered her concentration instantly. Her fingers slipped, missing the next note entirely and hitting a discordant jangle of keys. The music died with an ugly thud. She froze. The blood rushed to her face so fast it made her ears ring. She could feel the heat creeping up her neck. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help it. She turned her head slightly to the left. There they were. Jason and his friends. Jason was still laughing, a smirk plastered on his face, looking right at her. He took a sip of his drink, completely at ease. He didn't look sorry. He looked like he was just having a good time at her expense. The realization washed over her cold and heavy. Everyone was watching. The people at the nearby tables had stopped talking to look at the interruption. The basketball conversation had paused. All eyes were shifting from Jason to her. She felt small. She felt silly. She felt like a child who had been caught pretending to be an adult. The music she loved so much, the thing that felt like her soul, suddenly felt like a weakness. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling just enough to be visible if someone was looking closely. She wanted to sink into the floor. She wanted to grab her bag and run out the sliding glass doors and never come back. The silence stretched out for a second, heavy and uncomfortable, waiting for her to make the next move. Jason raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "Well, are you done?" Elora gripped the edge of the piano bench. Her knuckles turned white. The humiliation sat in her stomach like a stone. This was exactly why she usually stayed in the background. This was why she never put herself out there. The world was loud, and people like Jason were ready to crush anything quiet. She could leave now. It would be easy. She could pack up her music, stand up, and walk away while they laughed at her back. They would forget about her in 5 minutes. But she would remember. She would remember the laugh every time she sat down at a piano for the rest of her life. She would remember feeling like her art was a joke. She looked down at the yellowed sheet music. The notes were scattered across the page like blackbirds. She had practiced this piece for months. She knew every curve of the melody, every dynamic shift. It was beautiful. It was beautiful, regardless of what some guy in a rock t-shirt thought. The urge to flee was almost overpowering. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The noise of the room started to creep back in, waiting to swallow her up. But then, something else stirred under the embarrassment. A tiny, stubborn spark. It was anger, maybe, or pride. It was the feeling that she had just as much right to be there as Jason did. He could make noise with his voice, she could make noise with her hands. She wasn't playing for them. She wasn't playing to impress a bunch of strangers in a cafeteria. She was playing because she loved it. Ilora took a slow, shaky breath. She blinked away the stinging in her eyes. She didn't look at Jason again. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the keys. She waited for the shaking in her hands to stop. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let a laugh be the end of her song. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed her foot down on the sustain pedal. She adjusted her fingers on the keys, finding the starting position again. She closed her eyes for a second, shutting out the fluorescent lights, the dirty floors, and the laughing faces. She went back to the beginning. The air in the Union building felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her shoulders. For a few seconds, the only sound Ilora could hear was the blood rushing in her ears. That loud, barking laugh from the guy in the rock t-shirt kept echoing in her mind. It felt like a scratch on a record, ruining the music before it even really started. She sat frozen on the hard bench, her hands hovering over the keys, her fingers curled and stiff. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. It was the most natural thing in the world. When you are embarrassed, when you are mocked, you hide. That is how human beings are wired. Her brain was already forming the plan: grab the backpack, zip it up, stand up quickly, and walk toward the exit without making eye contact with anyone. She could go sit in the library, or maybe just outside on the steps where it was quiet and safe. She could feel the eyes of the room on her back. It felt like a physical weight. She knew the guy Jason, she thought she heard someone call him, was still watching her. He was probably waiting for it. He was waiting for her to prove him right. He wanted her to scurry away like a mouse that had been spotted in a kitchen. If she left now, his laugh would be the ending of the story. The piano would sit there silent again, and the only memory anyone would have of her would be that moment of awkwardness. Ilora's grip tightened on the edge of the piano bench. The wood was hard under her fingers, digging into her skin. She looked down at the keys. They were just plastic and ivory, but right now they felt like the edge of a cliff. She thought about her apartment back home. It was a small place, always a bit messy, with thin walls where you could hear the neighbors arguing at night. The only time the world felt right was when she played her old keyboard there. She played for herself, not for an audience. She played because the music took the weight off her chest. It made her feel like she was floating. She looked at the sheet music sitting on the rack. It was Clair de Lune. Moonlight. It was a piece about a quiet night, about peace, about things that are soft and hidden. It felt so out of place here, in this noisy, bright room full of people rushing around and shouting over coffee. Jason was right about one thing: it was a strange contrast. But it wasn't funny. It was tragic. Ilora took a deep breath. She breathed in the smell of burnt coffee and floor wax, and she let it out slowly. She decided something right there. She decided that she wasn't going to let a stranger take this away from her. This was her break. This was her time. She had just as much right to be here as he did. She stopped thinking about the crowd. She stopped thinking about Jason and his friends. She closed her eyes for a moment and imagined she was back in her living room. The walls were just white paint, but in her mind, they were soundproof. The noise of the cafeteria faded away until it was just a dull hum, like traffic outside a window. Her hands were still shaking a little bit, but she forced them to relax. She shook them out gently, dropping her arms to her sides to let the tension drain away, and then she lifted them back up. She placed her fingers on the starting notes. Gently. Softly. She wasn't going to play louder to drown them out. That wasn't what the song was about. If she tried to bang on the keys, she would lose. She would just be adding to the noise. The only way to win was to do the opposite. She had to be so quiet, so gentle, that they would have to shut up just to hear her. It was a crazy idea, a desperate idea, but it was the only one she had. She pressed down on the first key. The note was soft. It was barely a whisper. It was so quiet that it shouldn't have been heard at all in a room this big. But because it was so quiet, it had a strange kind of power. It didn't fight the noise, it sat underneath it. She played the next note, and the next. She didn't rush. The panic that had made her fingers jerk before was gone, replaced by a slow, deliberate focus. She wasn't attacking the piano anymore, she was caressing it. She leaned closer to the keys, listening to the sound decay, letting the silence between the notes stretch out. For the first 10 seconds, nobody cared. The noise level in the room stayed the same. The clatter of trays continued. The laughing group near the pillar was still talking, probably making another joke. But Ilora didn't let it distract her. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on her hands, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. She was inside the music now. She reached a section of the song where the melody started to climb higher. It was a hopeful part of the piece, a part where the music seemed to be looking for something. Her fingers danced a little faster, moving across the octaves with a lightness that defied the stiffness she felt earlier. She was remembering why she loved this. The feeling of the weight of the keys, the vibration traveling up her fingers into her arms, it was a connection that she couldn't explain to anyone who didn't play. Something subtle began to happen in the room. It wasn't a sudden hush like in a movie. It was slower than that. At a table near the piano, two girls were studying for an exam. One of them kept tapping her pen on the table, a nervous habit. Tap, tap, tap. It was annoying, but rhythmic. As Ilora's music flowed, the girl's pen seemed to sync up with the piano for a moment, and then, unconsciously, the girl stopped tapping. She looked up, frowning slightly, realizing she could hear the piano more clearly now. The music was like a thread being pulled through a messy knot. It didn't untangle the whole knot at once, but it started to pull the edges together. Ilora's confidence grew. She wasn't thinking about the people anymore. She was thinking about the moonlight. She was thinking about the way the light hits the water at night, how it makes everything look silver and still. She tried to put that image into the sound. She played the soft chords with a feather-light touch, pressing the keys just deep enough to make the felt hammers kiss the strings. The sound was starting to bleed past the first circle of tables. A guy sitting alone with a laptop pulled his headphones off. He had been listening to heavy metal, but he paused it. He looked over his shoulder, annoyed at first that someone was making noise. But when he saw the girl hunched over the piano, looking so small and yet producing such a clear sound, His irritation softened. He didn't go back to his music. He started to type a little quieter, the clacking of his keys matching the volume of the piano. Back near the pillar, Jason took a sip of his drink. He was still leaning against the wall, looking cool, but his attention was drifting. The laugh had been fun in the moment, but the moment was passing. He looked at his friends, ready to start a new conversation about a party that weekend. But one of his friends wasn't paying attention. The friend, a taller guy with a baseball cap, was looking past Jason, staring at the piano with a confused look on his face. "Dude," the friend muttered, nudging Jason's arm. "What?" Jason asked, turning around. He thought the friend was pointing out a girl walking by or something. "Listen," the friend said. Jason frowned. He turned back toward the corner. He expected to hear the girl struggling again, or maybe to see her packing up. Instead, he heard the music. It was the same song she had started before, but it was different now. Before, she had been stiff, and the sound had been weak. Now, the sound was fluid. It rolled like water. There was a sadness to it that he hadn't expected. It wasn't just notes, it was a feeling. It sounded lonely, but in a way that felt strong. Jason watched her hands. He played guitar in a band, but he played loud. He liked power chords and distortion. He didn't know how she was making that much emotion come out of an old school piano without hitting the keys hard. She looked like she was barely touching them. The mockery died on his lips. He didn't want to admit it, but it was actually kind of good. It was weird, but it was good. He took another sip of his soda, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching. Illyra felt a shift in the atmosphere, but she didn't let it pull her out of the zone. She knew she was reaching the part of the song where the rhythm got tricky. The timing had to be perfect, or the whole spell would break. She focused all her energy on her right hand, letting the left hand support the melody like a foundation. She wasn't the scared girl on the bench anymore. She was a musician. And in this moment, the music was the only thing that was real. The change in the room didn't happen because someone told everyone to be quiet. It wasn't a teacher scolding a class or a teacher turning off the lights. It was something much slower and stranger, like a tide changing direction. It happened because the music was forcing them to pay attention, whether they wanted to or not. Illyra was past the point of no return now. She had navigated the tricky opening section, and the melody was starting to open up. Her fingers were finding their groove, sliding over the keys with a familiarity that contradicted how nervous she looked. Her body was still tense, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she was trying to make herself as small as possible, but her hands were confident. She was playing a run of notes that moved quickly, cascading down the keyboard like rain falling down a window pane. The sound wasn't loud enough to echo, but it was sharp and clear. It cut through the ambient noise of the cafeteria, the humming of the refrigerators, the distant chatter like a knife. Jason was still standing by the pillar, but his posture had changed. He wasn't leaning back with that bored, cool smirk anymore. He had pushed himself off the wall and was standing up straight, both hands holding his soda cup. He was looking directly at Illyra. He didn't really know classical music. He didn't know who Debussy was, and he couldn't tell a sonata from a symphony. But he knew what skill looked like. He watched her hands. They were moving independently of each other, the left hand playing a slow, steady rhythm while the right hand danced frantically above it. It looked complicated. It looked like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time, but 10 times harder. He thought about the laugh he had let out earlier. It felt different now. A few minutes ago, it had felt like harmless fun, just breaking the tension of a boring afternoon. Now, watching her fingers fly, that laugh felt small. It felt mean. He realized that making fun of someone who was trying to do something difficult was easy, but actually doing the difficult thing was rare. Next to him, his friend with the baseball cap stopped checking his phone. He tilted his head to the side, listening. "She's actually pretty good," he mumbled, keeping his voice low. Jason nodded slowly. He didn't say anything. He just took another sip of his drink, but his eyes never left the piano. The silence was spreading. It started with the people closest to the piano. The two girls who were studying had given up on pretending to study. One of them had her chin resting on her hand, her eyes half closed, letting the music wash over her. The guy with the laptop had stopped typing completely. He was just sitting there, staring at the screensaver, letting the music fill the empty space in his head. It was fascinating how the music worked. It wasn't aggressive. Illyra wasn't banging her fists on the keys or demanding their attention. If anything, she was doing the opposite. She was playing softly, pulling them in. She was creating a void that they wanted to fall into. In a world that was so loud and fast, where everyone was shouting to be heard, here was something that asked for nothing but a moment of peace. Illyra reached a part of the song where the tempo slowed down. The melody became more exposed. There were fewer chords, just single notes ringing out into the air. This was the dangerous part. If she missed a note now, there would be no music to hide it. The silence would swallow the mistake. She felt the pressure. The muscles in her forearms were starting to burn a little, a reminder that she hadn't played this continuously in a long time. She focused on the weight of her arms, trying to let gravity do the work. She breathed in rhythm with the phrases in, out, out. She was no longer in the student union. She was in a bubble. She thought about the piece she was playing. Clair de Lune means moonlight. It was about the night, but not a scary night. It was about the beauty of the dark, the way the world looks different when the sun goes down and the shadows get long. She tried to picture it. She tried to put that imagery into the touch of her fingers. She played the high notes gently, like stars twinkling. Because she was so focused on the feeling of the song, her face changed. The fear, the embarrassment, the tension, they all melted away. She looked peaceful. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic room around her. Seeing that look on her face made it hard for anyone to mock her. You can't laugh at someone who looks like they are in a trance. A group of 3 guys walked in through the main entrance. They were loud, wearing sports jerseys, laughing loudly at a joke one of them had just made. They walked into the center of the room, their voices booming. And then he says one of them started, but his voice trailed off. He stopped walking. The other 2 bumped into him, annoyed. "Hey, watch it," one said. "SHH," the first guy whispered. He pointed toward the corner. The 3 of them stood there, looking awkward. They were holding their helmets, looking like they didn't belong in a scene like this. But they didn't leave. They stayed there, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, listening. It was like a spell was being cast over the room. The energy was shifting from aggressive and noisy to something else. It was becoming communal. All these people, students, teachers, jocks, loners, were being pulled into the same experience. They didn't know each other, and they usually ignored each other, but for a few minutes, they were all listening to the same thing. Jason felt that connection. He looked around the room and saw that everyone was looking at the girl. He realized that he wasn't the leader of the room anymore, the guy making the jokes. He was just another listener. The girl in the cardigan, who he had dismissed as nobody, was the one in control. She had the power now. She was the one deciding what the mood was. It made him feel strange. It wasn't exactly jealousy, but it was a feeling of insignificance. He spent so much time trying to look cool and get people to look at him, but here she was, not trying at all, and she was holding the entire room in the palm of her hand. Ilora didn't notice the shifting crowd. She didn't see the athletes standing by the door or the baristas leaning over the counter to listen. She only knew that the piano felt good. The notes were connecting, one to the next, creating a chain of sound that made sense. She felt a warmth spreading in her chest, pushing away the cold memory of the laugh. She was playing for herself, but she wasn't alone anymore. The music was creating a bridge between her and the room. She was pouring her loneliness into the keys, and the room was drinking it up, understanding it without needing words. She started to play the climax of the piece. The music got louder, fuller. The chords were deeper, resonating in the body of the piano. She put more force into it, but she kept the emotion smooth. It wasn't angry, it was passionate. It was a cry that was beautiful instead of painful. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the high-ceilinged hall. The vibrations of the low notes hummed in the floor. It was a sound that demanded respect. Jason watched her face contort slightly as she hit a difficult stretch. He saw the sweat on her forehead. He realized that this was hard work. It took guts to sit there and pour your heart out, especially after someone laughed at you. He found himself rooting for her, hoping she wouldn't mess up. He wanted to see where the music went. The silence was complete now. The only sound in the entire building was the piano. Even the espresso machine seemed to have been turned off, or maybe nobody was pressing the buttons. The clatter of trays had stopped. Nobody was eating. Everyone was just listening. It was a fragile moment. It felt like if someone dropped a spoon, the whole world might shatter. But Ilora kept playing, holding them all there, suspended in the moonlight she was creating. The silence that had taken over the room was no longer just the absence of noise. It had become a physical presence, a heavy, living thing that filled every corner of the student union. It was the kind of silence that you feel in your chest, pressing against your lungs, making you afraid to even breathe too loudly. The air, which had been stale and smelling of burnt coffee just 10 minutes ago, now seemed charged with electricity. It felt like the atmosphere right before a storm breaks, but without the threat of rain. It was a storm of emotion. Ilora had entered a state of flow that she rarely experienced. Her hands, which had been stiff and cold at the start, were now warm and loose. She wasn't thinking about individual notes anymore. She wasn't thinking about where her fingers were supposed to go. The music had moved from her brain down into her instincts. It was like she was channeling something that was coming through her, rather than something she was creating herself. She was in the deepest, most complex part of the song now. The melody was jumping around, requiring her left hand to cross over her right, twisting her wrists in ways that looked painful but felt graceful. She was playing with an intensity that made her hair stick to her forehead with sweat. In the bright fluorescent lighting of the cafeteria, she looked wild. Her oversized cardigan was slipping off one shoulder, and her foot was pressing the sustain pedal into the floor with a steady rhythm. To the people watching, it was mesmerizing. They weren't just hearing a song, they were witnessing a transformation. The girl who had walked in looking like she wanted to disappear was now commanding the space. She was powerful. Standing by the pillar, Jason felt a tightness in his throat that he couldn't explain. He watched the way Ilara's body moved with the music. When the notes went high, she leaned forward, stretching her neck, reaching for something that wasn't there. When the notes went low, digging into the deep, sad chords, she seemed to sink into the piano, her shoulders curling inward. He realized then that he had been wrong about her. He had looked at her clothes and her quiet demeanor and thought she was boring. He thought she was weak. But he was seeing now that she was stronger than he was. He made noise to get attention. She made something beautiful to give a piece of herself away. There was a bravery in that he didn't have. The music was shifting again. It was moving away from the chaotic, swirling middle section and heading toward the resolution. The tempo was slowing down, but the feeling was getting heavier. It was like the sun was setting, and the shadows were getting longer. The notes were becoming more sparse, hanging in the air for a long time before fading away. Ilara's fingers were getting tired. She could feel the strain in her forearms, a dull ache that threatened to break her concentration. But she didn't let it. She used the ache to fuel the emotion. She pressed down on the keys harder, making the piano sing out a cry that was almost heartbreaking. It was a sound of longing, of wanting something you can't have. The girl sitting at the table nearest to the piano had tears in her eyes. She wasn't crying loudly, but the tears were just sitting there, sparkling. She had felt lonely all day, missing her family, and Ilara's music had touched that bruise. It was amazing how a stranger playing an old instrument could make you feel so understood. The girl wiped her eye quickly, looking around to see if anyone noticed, but no one was looking at her. Everyone was locked on the piano. Even the people at the back of the room, the ones who couldn't see Ilara clearly, had stopped what they were doing. The card tables were full of unfinished games, trays of half-eaten food, and open textbooks, but the people were statues. It was as if a spell had been cast that froze time. If a fire alarm had gone off right then, people probably would have been annoyed at the interruption. Jason's friend with the baseball cap nudged him again, but this time it wasn't to make a joke. He just pointed at the piano and shook his head slowly. "Crazy," he whispered. "I didn't think this place could feel like this." Jason nodded. He couldn't speak. He felt weirdly emotional, which wasn't a feeling he liked to have in public. He was used to keeping things light, keeping things funny. But this was stripping away all his defenses. The music was raw. It was stripping away the cool irony he wore like a shield. He felt exposed, and it was uncomfortable, but he couldn't look away. Ilara was approaching the end now. She knew it was coming. The sheet music on the rack told her what notes to play, but her heart told her how to play them. She took a deep breath, feeling the air rush into her lungs, and let her fingers hover for just a split second before the final run. She played the last sequence of notes carefully, giving each one its own moment of life. Ding, da-dum, ding. The high notes sparkled like stars, echoing in the high ceiling of the hall. Then, her left hand played the final chord. It wasn't a loud crash. It was a soft, deep, resonant hum. She pressed the pedal down, letting the sound sustain, letting the strings vibrate together in harmony. She lifted her hands off the keys. The sound didn't stop immediately. It floated in the air, swirling around the room, bouncing off the walls and the glass windows. It was a beautiful ghost of a sound. And then, slowly, it began to decay. It got softer and softer, until it was just a whisper, and then, finally, it was gone. Ilara kept her hands resting on her knees. She didn't move. She was afraid to move. She sat there with her head bowed, looking at her lap, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was breathing hard, as if she had just run a race. The silence that followed was the heaviest silence of all. It was the silence of 100 people holding their breath at the same time. No one spoke. No one clapped. No one moved a muscle. The vacuum left by the music was vast. It felt like the room was empty, even though it was packed with people. The hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed deafeningly loud now, but even that seemed respectful. The barista stood frozen, their hands hovering over cups. Jason stared at the back of Ilara's head. He saw her shoulders rise and fall. He saw her hand reach up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a small, nervous gesture. He thought about the laugh again. It seemed so far away now, like it had happened in a different lifetime. He felt a small, stinging pang of guilt in his chest. He looked at his friends. They were all looking at the floor, or at their shoes, looking like they had just witnessed something private that they weren't supposed to see. Nobody knew what to do. Do you clap? Do you cheer? It didn't feel right. Clapping felt like it would break the spell too harshly. It felt like it would turn this moment of shared vulnerability into just another performance. The room had ceased to be a cafeteria, it had become a sanctuary, and you don't cheer in a sanctuary. You just sit with the feeling. Ilara sat on the bench, the silence stretching out. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. She felt her face getting hot again, but this time it was different. It wasn't shame. It was the heat of the spotlight. She knew they were all watching her. She could feel their gaze like a physical weight. She waited for the reaction, but the reaction was just more silence. It was terrifying, but it was also incredible. She had done it. She had taken a room full of chaos and turned it into a church. She had made the loud, arrogant boy in the corner stop laughing. She had made the lonely girl cry. She had touched them all. And she had done it just by being herself. Slowly, shakily, Ilara stood up. The movement broke the stillness slightly. The sound of her shoes on the floor seemed to snap a few people out of their trance. She reached out and closed the lid over the keys. Thud. It was a final, definitive sound. She picked up her backpack, shoving her sheet music inside without looking at it. She slung the bag over her shoulder, pulling her cardigan tight around herself. She didn't look up. She couldn't look at them. If she looked at them and saw their faces, she might cry, or she might smile, and she wasn't ready for either. She turned toward the exit. The path that had been clear when she walked in was now crowded with people standing around, listening. But as she moved, a strange thing happened. The crowd began to part. It wasn't an organized parting, it was a ripple. People stepped back, shifting their weight, creating a narrow aisle for her to walk through. They moved out of her way without speaking, their eyes following her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She walked past the table where the girl had been crying. The girl looked up, her eyes wide, trying to catch Ilara's eye, but Ilara was looking at the floor. She walked past the group of athletes. They stood silently, their helmets under their arms, looking like statues. She walked past the bar. The barista, a guy with piercings and a tired face, just nodded at her. A small, slow nod of respect. And then she was approaching the pillar. The corner where Jason was standing. Her heart started to hammer against her ribs again. This was the hardest part. She had to walk past the person who had tried to humiliate her. She could feel him there. She could feel his energy. She kept her head down, watching her shoes hit the dirty linoleum tiles. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. She was almost past him. Jason looked at her. He saw her pale face, the way she was biting her lip, the way she was clutching the strap of her backpack so hard her knuckles were white. He wanted to say something. He wanted to open his mouth and say, "Good job," or "I'm sorry," or "Wow." The words were right there on the tip of his tongue. But his throat felt dry and glued shut. The silence of the room was too strong. It felt like if he spoke, he would ruin it. He just stood there, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, the soda cup in his hand forgotten. He watched her walk by, feeling a strange mixture of respect and regret. He realized he would never look at a piano player the same way again. Ilora passed him. She didn't look up. She didn't know he was regretting anything. She just knew she had to get out. She had to get to the air. She pushed the handle of the glass exit door. It opened with a heavy thunk, letting in a rush of cool outside air. She slipped through the crack, disappearing from the Union building, leaving the silence behind her. As soon as the door clicked shut, the spell in the room broke. But nobody cheered. The noise didn't rush back in all at once. It returned slowly, like people waking up from a dream. Someone whispered, "Who was that?" Someone else let out a long breath they didn't know they were holding. Jason stood there by the pillar, looking at the empty space where she had been. He looked down at the floor, then back at the piano. It was just an old, beat-up instrument sitting in the corner again. But it felt different now. It felt important. He shook his head, a small, genuine smile finally touching his lips. He threw his empty cup in the trash and turned to his friends. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." The glass-paneled door swung shut behind Ilora, cutting off the hum of the student union and sealing it inside. She stepped out into the open air and immediately felt the difference. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the campus quad. The air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the stuffy, coffee-scented warmth of the building she had just left. Ilora walked quickly. Her legs felt shaky, like they might give out at any moment, but she forced them to move. She didn't look back. She was terrified that if she looked back, she would see people laughing at her through the glass. She was convinced that the moment she was gone, the spell would break and the room would erupt into jokes about her clothes or her serious face. She just wanted to get to her next class, or maybe just to a quiet bench where she could hide. She found a spot on a concrete ledge near the library fountain. It was far enough away from the Union that she couldn't hear the noise, but close enough that she could still see the building looming in the distance. She sat down and put her head in her hands. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her ears. Slowly, the adrenaline started to wear off, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. She replayed the last 20 minutes in her mind. She remembered the cruel laugh, the stinging humiliation, and then the strange, determined decision to keep playing. She remembered how the room had gone quiet. But mostly, she remembered the feeling of the music. For the first time in a long time, she had felt truly seen, even if she was too scared to look at the people seeing her. Deep down, under the anxiety, a tiny seed of pride was starting to grow. She had done it. She had faced her fear and she hadn't backed down. She had turned a moment of cruelty into something else entirely. Inside the Union, the atmosphere was shifting back to normal, but it was a different kind of normal. The heavy, reverent silence that had held the room captive had finally broken, but it didn't snap back into loud chaos immediately. It unraveled slowly. People started talking again, but their voices were lower. They weren't shouting, they were murmuring. The clatter of trays returned, but it seemed less aggressive. The baristas went back to work, but they moved with a little less haste, a little more thoughtfulness. Jason was still standing by the pillar. His friends had started a conversation about a football game, trying to lighten the mood, but Jason wasn't participating. He was staring at the spot where Illyria had been sitting. The piano bench was empty now. The instrument looked silent and dormant, like a sleeping animal. He felt weird. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something important. It wasn't just the music, although that was part of it. It was the resilience. He had tried to break her focus. He had tried to make her feel small. And instead of crumbling, she had stood her ground and blown everyone away. She had taken his mockery and used it as fuel to create something beautiful. He looked at his friends, who were laughing about something unrelated. The laughter sounded different to him now. It sounded hollow. It sounded immature. He realized that making fun of people wasn't actually funny. It was just easy. It was the lazy way to get attention. Illyria had done the hard thing. She had been vulnerable. "Dude, you coming?" his friend asked, nudging his arm. "We're gonna go grab some food before the rush." Jason hesitated. He looked at the exit doors Illyria had walked through. He felt a strong urge to go after her. Not to make more jokes, but to apologize. Or maybe just to say that he listened. He wanted to tell her that she changed the vibe of the whole room. But he stopped himself. He realized that chasing after her might be the worst thing he could do. She had just left. She was probably overwhelmed. If he walked up to her now, even with good intentions, she might just see the guy who laughed at her. She might think he was coming to mock her again. He didn't want to ruin whatever peace she had found. "No," Jason said, shaking his head. "I think I'm gonna hang here for a bit." "You sure?" the friend asked. "Yeah," Jason said. "I'm good." His friends shrugged and walked out, their laughter fading as they pushed through the doors. Jason stood there alone for a moment, looking at the piano. He walked over to it slowly. He stood in front of the keys, looking at the sheet music that was no longer there. He reached out and touched the wood of the cabinet gently. It felt solid and real. He wasn't a piano player. He didn't know the first thing about reading music. But looking at the keys, he felt a strange sense of respect for the instrument and for the girl who had played it. He realized that everyone walking past had a story. Everyone had a hidden depth that you couldn't see if you just looked at their clothes or their demeanor. He had judged a book by its cover, and he had been completely wrong. He sighed, a long, exhaling breath that seemed to release the last of his arrogance. He turned and walked away, leaving the piano alone in the corner, but seeing it with new eyes. Outside, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The sky was turning a brilliant shade of orange and purple. It was the kind of sunset that looked like a painting. Illyria sat on the concrete ledge, watching the colors change. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't shaking. She looked at her hands. They were the same hands she had always had, but they felt different. They felt capable. She thought about the people in the union. She wondered if they would remember her tomorrow. Probably not. They would go back to their coffee and their exams and their loud conversations. She would just be that girl who played the piano that one time. And that was okay. She didn't need to be famous. She didn't need everyone to know her name. She just needed to know that she could do it. She stood up and slung her backpack over her shoulder. The weight felt lighter now. She adjusted her cardigan, pulling it tight against the evening chill. She had a chemistry lab to get to. She had notes to take and equations to balance. The world was still turning, and her problems weren't magically gone. But inside, she felt stronger. As she walked toward the science building, she passed a group of students sitting on the grass. They were playing guitars and singing loudly, strumming chords with confident energy. In the past, she would have crossed the street to avoid them, intimidated by their noise and their confidence. She would have felt small and invisible. But today, she didn't cross the street. She walked right past them. She listened to their music, and she appreciated it for what it was. She realized that there was room for all kinds of music in the world. There was room for the loud, strumming guitars, and there was room for the quiet, delicate piano. They both had a place. She smiled to herself, a small, private smile that no one else saw. She thought about the silence in the room. She thought about how it felt to hold 100 people in the palm of her hand. She walked into the science building, the heavy automatic doors sliding open for her. The hallway was bright and smelled like floor wax. It was quiet here, too, but a different kind of quiet. This was the silence of concentration, of study. Ilora found her classroom and took a seat near the back. She pulled out her notebook and a pen. As the professor began to talk about molecules and bonds, Ilora found herself writing something in the margin of her page. She wasn't taking notes. She was drawing a tiny, little piano. The laugh didn't haunt her anymore. It had been swallowed by the music. She had survived the afternoon, and she had come out the other side with a little more armor around her heart. She knew she would play again. Maybe not in that cafeteria, maybe not tomorrow. But she would play again. And next time, when the first wrong note came out, or when someone in the crowd frowned, she wouldn't be afraid. She would just play through it. The class went on, the sounds of scribbling pens filling the room. Ilora looked out the window at the darkening campus. The lights were coming on in the student union. Somewhere in that building, the old piano sat in the corner, waiting for the next person to sit down and tell a story. And for the first time in her life, Ilora felt like she was the protagonist of her own story, not just a background character someone else could laugh at. She was the one playing the music. And that was enough.